Top five, top five, top five.
Yeah, girl, you ready to do this? You ready to count this thing down? We're doing the top five, her. Yeah, let's set it off with 1, 2, 3, 4.
Let's go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Ranked Top 5 List of Stuff That Don't Matter. I'm your Dungeon Master, Tuong La, and I'm here with a bunch of nerds in the pod cavern today. Air horn. I have a soundboard now, guys. So I'm going to use it quite liberally. Let's hear it again.
Nobody warned us about the soundboard.
I'll try to not use it as much, but honestly, my role here today is just to fuck around and be the moderator. We have a kind of a exciting show for us today in the pod cavern. Unlike every episode of Ranked, where there's only 4 of us, and one time we had 3 of us, and I'm usually in it, we have a room of 5, and it's a really exciting topic, and you'll soon find out why it's 5, because I'm not smart enough to talk on this topic alone, which is why I got 4 other much smarter guests to talk on today's episode. But before I introduce what that episode's about, I want to introduce my guest to my physical right, Sascha Lecours.
I wasn't told I had to be smarter than you do. I don't think I meet that. I'm Sascha. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm going to pass it over to Jordana Heney.
Jordana, welcome to the show.
Hello, I'm Jordana. It's nice to see everybody. I'm going to say hi and then pass it on to Bryan Robinson.
Hey guys, really happy to be here, and I'm also really happy that we have Josef Addleman with us today too.
Oh my, greetings Ranked Nation.
Josef Addleman, everyone. I mean, we have to pause for a second in the way that Joe used to live with me, used to share my towels, used to wash my dishes, used to coddle me in my sleep when I was feeling lonely. And it's been way too long, Joe.
It has, since you've been cuddled.
Yeah.
Thankfully, you're married now. You have somebody else to do that for you.
You think that would happen when you get married, but Lord doesn't do that. So I use a body pillow of you, Joe.
That is fair. Yes, you might remember me from such Ranked episodes as Gateway Board Games and something about, I think, episode 2, Potluck.
Prize winners. Prize winners. Yeah, we talked about the best potluck. Wow, it's been a long time, Joe. I missed you.
I'm old.
This might have been the fastest introductions we've ever had. Usually everyone talks a little bit about themselves, but we're like, let's just get right into the show. Well, we have 3 new people who have never stepped foot in the pod cavern, which is super exciting. Lots of firsts today. And this is the first 5-man episode, like I said, because we're talking about top 5 tabletop RPGs. Is that what I said in the chat? Was that the type?
That is what you said in the chat.
Sounds right.
Yeah, that sounds right. I forgot. And yeah, I am someone who loves this stuff from the outside in the way that, like, I deeply respect it. Sascha and I have actually played some games together. Joe used to run games in our old apartment together when we weren't cuddling.
I like the way you just about said the name of a game and then you bit your tongue. We don't want to jump the gun on naming any RPGs.
I will not. I'm a professional, Joe. And yeah, it's just one of those hobbies that I think that has always been around. And I think it's reached peak popularity when the pandemic started, especially because everyone's like, well, shit, we gotta do some stuff. And now there's been popular movies based on tabletop RPGs. I won't say the name of that movie. I think it's never been a better time. Would you agree?
I think it's way more mainstream than it ever was before, and I'm excited for that. But I also kind of feel sad because now everyone's into it. It's no fair.
I was going to say that since we're plugging 12 different role-playing games here, I'm sure we're going to get a little bit into some of the niche ones to have some of our nerd cred. So look forward to that.
Jordana has had like an evil little hand gesture just now, as in all of hers is going to be
rubbing my
niche.
hands together maniacally, ready for the weirdest of games.
I love it. Well, you are all the experts today, and I'm here just your normal nerd, but you're all advanced nerds, let's just say. Okay, so before we get started, let's go into the ground rules. What are the ground rules for today's episode on tabletop RPGs? Anyone want to start?
I think accessibility should be number 1. Like, tabletop RPGs are something that a lot of people feel like they can't get into because they don't know somebody or they haven't read the books. And like, accessibility has to be number 1. in my brain. Like that's what I'm thinking.
Cool.
For sure. It's actually like
Sense.
one of the, for my number one nomination as we get into them, and the one that I'm going to be pushing pretty hard for here. I think accessibility is like the number one thing that I have here.
So I thought I was being a real like rebel by picking a list that's mainly based around accessibility, but I think maybe a lot of us had the same idea. So my list is primarily about accessible games too, so I'm all for it.
And
I
Joe?
was going to say number one criteria should be the amount of numbers on a single piece of paper
Yes.
to determine how
Yeah.
good a game is. But I can go with the crowd here. That's fine.
Yeah.
For me, role-playing games are really just about like the amount to which everybody around that table is engaged in telling a story and surprising each other and having fun. So whatever means kind of support that as long as you're having a creative experience that you're going to remember. That's what makes a good game.
Totally. I was going to ask, maybe I'll ask you, Sascha, is that a lot of our audience for Ranked is just a vast amount of different types of people who listen to this show, because we rank all sorts of things: movies, pizza toppings, potluck stuff, cereal. Like, it's just random, right? Some people, especially this, I love this accessibility angle because it kind of caters towards the general audience. But for people who don't know what a tabletop RPG is, can you give me the 3 to 5 sentence of what that even is?
A tabletop RPG game could be a lot of different things, but I think the general common features are that you sit around a table or a Zoom call with some friends and you invent a sort of narrative experience. Usually there will be one person who's sort of creating a prompt for the story. Everyone else will make a fictional character, and it could be in a fantastical fantasy setting. It could be historical fiction. It could be the far future. It could be the present, and the genre could be high adventure. It could be horror. It could be a detective story. And there will be a set of rules that move the game along. They can be simple, or they could be very complicated and have a lot of numbers on a page, and you might need a dump truck to roll all your dice. But at the end of the day, there will be a little element of random chance, and you get an unexpected story that is told and experienced by all the people around that table. And I invite everyone else to add details I might have missed since I just improvised this.
That sounds pretty legit. Anyone else want to add to that definition there?
It was perfect. I loved it.
Yeah, I think that's
eloquent.
a great summary.
Better than what I could do. I was like, paper and dice, go. That was my
Sasha
definition.
rolled a D20 in speech today.
I'm saving my natural ones for my arguments.
Should we just get into it? Probably.
Yeah.
Oh, show.
Okay. And yeah, I'm excited because this will open my eyes to some new RPGs for myself and hopefully our audience too. So just like every episode of Ranked, we're going to go around 3 times, nominating 3 nominations each, making a master list of 12 and whittling that down to a top 5 tabletop RPGs list.
Let's get going.
How about Sascha? You have the first nomination. What's it going to be?
What an honor. Okay, my top nomination and the game I'm by far the most excited to bring today is Dungeon World by Sage LaTorra and Adam Coble. Dungeon World is, I like to describe it as what you wish Dungeons & Dragons was when you haven't played it yet. It's a game that has a fantasy setting with very classic archetypes: the fighter, the wizard, the rogue, the hunter. And what's special about this game is that all the rules a player needs to play are on their character sheet. So if you've never played an RPG before and you sit down to play Dungeon World, you only need to look at one piece of paper in front of you, which you tick little boxes to say like, oh, I've chosen massive attack and bag of books. And the game really emphasizes creating your character through narrative and through improvisation during the game, rather than pouring through a big rule book and having to have someone help you and forgetting how many dice you add to what. It's all there in front of you. You have all the rules you need. So I think it's a fantastic entry for accessibility because you can sit down having never even heard of a tabletop RPG, make your character by picking the sheet that looks cool to you, ticking boxes, and you're ready to play. And then the rules unfold as you're playing, so you don't need to do nearly as much explaining and prep work and like, actually, table 76-D indicates you need a 5-foot step. In combat, the initiative system is open. You can just sort of say what you want to do. The same person can do many things in a row. And then the DM sort of, or storyteller sort of decides when to switch perspectives. So it ends up coming out the same as a traditional game, but instead of having big breaks and pauses in between everyone's turn where they sort of lose attention and go to their phones, you have what flows more like a movie or a book. And people respond to this really well. It does require a lot of improv work from the storyteller. And finally, there's a big emphasis in this game on if there's a failure, it will have consequences, but in such a way that the story keeps advancing. You never fail and say, try again. You fail and say, now there's a shark in the room. What? Oh man, it's going to keep moving forward. Things will get interesting. And it does put an emphasis on, it has a great section on GMing, which emphasizes give narrative control to the players. Ask questions. So when your fighter encounters an enemy army, you might say, you recognize the enemy general. You've fought them before. Tell me about their fighting style, Greg. And then Greg will be like, oh, I have? He's an archer and he's an elf. And actually, we used to be lovers, but now we're enemies. So you can do this sort of thing, and it requires some improvisational skill from the storyteller. But the players have a great time with it, and they do not need to know. So essentially, if you're running these games, you take the burden of knowledge on yourself, and the new players can have a great experience. So that's Dungeon World.
One of the character options is not book bag, but bag of books.
Yes.
Much more descriptive.
That's very true. And actually, just to quickly go back, what I love about this game is it solves a huge problem with Dungeons & Dragons, which is like everyone's at the shop buying like, oh, I need to crowbar, 15 feet of rope, 3 chains, chalk. Instead of that, you have an item called dungeon gear. And it just has 5 charges. And when you need something, like you need a hammer, you mark a checkbox on dungeon gear, and then you write hammer in your inventory. Now you have a hammer. So a player who wants to prepare for a dungeon can just buy 1 bag of dungeon gear and you're done. And then when it happens, you have it. That's such a time saver because it avoids the people at a shop haggling for 8 hours scenario that we've all probably experienced, and I hate it.
I love
That's why
that
I
part
play
of it.
RPGs.
There's
my
some
favorite
joy
part.
in that.
If they made a system that was explicitly around making that fun, I'd be way into it.
Have you all played Dungeon World before, by the way? Everyone's thumbs up
I have
here?
not.
I have played Dungeon World with Sasha as my DM, and
Me
it
too.
was great.
Oh,
Yeah,
I have to say, it was going to be maybe my number one, my first recommendation, that is, anyway. Maybe not my number one, but my first one. I was recently going through my notes from a campaign that I ran in Dungeon World years ago with housemates, and just like remembering, and then that happened. And like, as the GM, you don't always get a chance to be that surprised by the plot in RPGs, but in a game like Dungeon World, you definitely do.
that's a great point. One of the rules for GMs is play to find out what happens. Not play to tell your story, which is a common, I want to call it a mistake. Play to find out what happens. You should be surprised, not, and then they'll do this, and then they'll do, and the game is trying to get you to do that.
It really does seem like an improv nerd's dream. Like, just here, I mean, we played this together too, and it's a good game.
If you're an improv nerd, it will treat you well.
I love that. Jordana, what's your first nomination?
I want to nominate GURPS, which is the generic universal role-playing system.
Wow.
I feel like it hits, just the title hits accessibility on the head. But when I thought about accessibility, I kind of broke it down into categories. And my categories were accessibility for different learning levels, monetary accessibility, and then like creative or like imaginative accessibility. Like there are people with aphantasia who like literally can't do the little mind movie that everybody else does, and like they shouldn't not be able to play D&D and other games and GURPS and stuff like that. So when I thought about that, I wanted to have like something that had like a reasonable amount of lore. There's books and stuff on GURPS. You can look at pretty pictures, so that kind of covers the creative imaginary quotient there. And the monetary accessibility is also there because it's only using D6s, which like not everybody wants to buy a set of fancy dice, especially if someone's just like drops by one day and they're like, hey, I want to try out an RPG. If you don't have the right dice, you're going to say no. But like lots of people just have D6s lying around their house from like Yahtzee or something. And then accessibility for different learning levels. I found that the rules in GURPS, while they are more than something like Dungeon World, they're very easy to understand. They don't feel like they're super heavy the way that other games do. So yeah, that's and you can hit any theme. You can do anything with GURPS. You can apply it to cyberpunk, you can apply it to high fantasy, you can apply it to on Sunday I went on the subway. Like you can honestly apply it to anything, and I really like that.
Cool. Has anyone interacted with GURPS before? I'm looking at Sasha, Joe, Brian.
I've never played it. I'm aware of it because it's one of those games that has been around forever. Jordana, I don't know if you know like when.
Yeah,
GURPS
so actually
was first.
I have that note. I wrote it down. It was published in 1986 at a time when most such systems were story or genre specific. So it was kind of a first for its kind.
Did you say 86?
86.
Oh, that predates me.
Yes. I was gonna say, it predates me as well. So
GURPS and I are contemporaries.
I just like saying GURPS. That's like a fun word.
GURPS.
it is a fun word. It's a super
One of the
fun
big
word.
selling points. for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I think that's the number one feature for me.
I was just wondering, based on that, like, not to get too much into the crunch of how things work, but a lot of older role-playing games kind of came out of like really, really nerdy, like war games and things like that, really breaking down minutia of stuff. And I guess GURPS was maybe one of the first ones designed to be generic, universal, could apply to anything. So it's probably a big change. But I'm wondering, like, have the systems been like updated? Are there new editions of GURPS, or is it just like has it stayed the same?
I'm pretty sure it's just stayed the same. To be honest, I don't know because I didn't DM it. But
it
I
works.
think it's just the one thing.
Cool.
Say that is a great question. I don't know the answer to it.
That's okay. It sounds accessible, which is, important to us. How about we go to Bryan? First nomination. What do you got?
All right. So I'm going to go in a very different direction here. I'm going to go much more mainstream than our first two nominations here. I'm going to do actually the game that I've played the most of, especially in recent years, and one that I play once a week and that I'm really the most excited about. So I'm going to go to Pathfinder 2E from Paizo. So once again, my kind of accessibility criteria here is a little bit different than the first two. So for people who aren't familiar with what Pathfinder is, so as I backtrack just slightly here, it actually spawned out of Dungeons and Dragons 3rd and 3.5 through the Open Gaming License, and it was actually made in the early 2000s. So anyone who's familiar with any sort of D&D game, whether or not it's a multitude of the variations and editions that have been released, you'll be very familiar with how, a standard character is built and kind of interacts in Pathfinder then. The second edition came out just a few years ago, and I think it's really one of the cleanest rule sets and one of the most dynamic rule sets. But when I want to talk about accessibility, my big thing for Pathfinder is a standard RPG's SRD versus the PRD. So an SRD, a lot of RPG games have, and it's a systems reference document. So usually it's an online or like, a printed sort of small section that will give you kind of a breakdown of a few things, what are feats, how do ancestries or backgrounds or races work and things like that as a way of learning specific rules and or whether or not it's tied to like a gaming license. So I'm not sure if everyone knows, but Dungeons and Dragons has an open gaming license, which is what a lot of third-party content is built off of. So you would use the SRD to start making your own third-party content as part of their free open gaming license. Pathfinder has the Pathfinder reference document, the PRD, which is actually partnered with a third-party company called Archives of Nethys, and all of their rules are 100% free online. So, Tuong, you're saying like, you might be the least familiar with tabletop RPGs, from our round table here, is that you could start playing with me today for zero investment and not have to use any of my material.
For free, you say? That's very
for free.
Intriguing.
And because it's actually done through an online publication through Archives of Nethys, is that it's easy no matter where you are. So if you're sitting around a table with friends and you have your laptop out, or you're like my group, we play once a week, and we've been playing once a week for just over 3 years now.
Oh my God.
We play through Roll20, which is an online tabletop platform, is that you can easily look up rules really quickly, or if you're trying to remember what something does, because like, maybe you missed a week or get back to things, is that it's so easy to pull things up without having to, run over to your bookshelf and grab your rule books and try and like, find that reference section then. Also tied to like, that release section is that Pathfinders or Paizo is really good at releasing a lot of content and quality content. And then other than the adventure paths, so the pre-written adventures, all of that information is available for free online. And because they're an actual partner with Paizo, is that it's updated almost on the day, the street release date. So, if you want to see new classes, new abilities, new interactions, new rules, you can basically do that on the street day of things that are released. So that's like one of the big things that I actually really like about the Pathfinder 2nd edition.
Wow. That's awesome. And Sascha, Jordana, Joe, anything to add to Pathfinder? I feel like you've all played it. Joe's holding a book right now.
I haven't played second ed, although I want to, because it does sound like it's better than first. Like they cleaned up stuff. So
100%.
Yeah.
So I think it was a good progression because they made another game between them, which we'll just call Pathfinder 1.5 because it's another one on my list here, which is actually like a very different scenario, which was a step up. But then this, it's honestly like my favorite rule set that I've ever played in any tabletop RPG.
Big praise.
Yeah. I'm going to say also just add in all the stuff you were talking about, the amount of information online that you can just kind of click through. I'm also a big fan as far as like Pathfinder is basically at the heart of it. It's a sword and sorcery fantasy setting. It was spun off of D&D, but the sort of base setting that they've created for it is just an enormous world that feels to me very well thought out and has actual interesting ideas in it. So I'm not usually that big a fan of the worlds that the game designers create for themselves, but this one I spent an awful lot of early lockdown days just clicking through articles of Nethys and learning about the world of Golarion and its history and its cosmos, and getting kind of excited about that. So that's a plus for me.
That's really cool. How about we go to Joe? What's your first nomination?
Oh, God, I don't know. I think I'm going to jump into, since we've talked a little bit about Dungeon World, which, by the way, is sort of part of a whole family of games that use similar systems and have some similar sort of improv-based vibe to them. But I think also much more loosely connected to that, a game came out, I don't know how long ago, within the last decade, and made quite a splash, called Blades in the Dark.
It's on my list as well, Joe.
was
I
on my
thought that
list
would
too.
be out there.
That's the game that we were supposed to
I had
play
like
together,
2
right,
pages of
Joe?
notes that I wanted to talk about. So.
Yeah, we tried to do that one with Tuong and a few other Ottawa people who we used to hang out with, and schedules just didn't really align very well.
We
as they
made
often do.
characters.
Yeah, we did like half a session of that, and it got silly.
Yeah.
But I have played sort of off and on with 2 different groups concurrently, set in the same worlds over the course of a year or so, and had some really good times. Okay, back to the setup here. What is Blades in the Dark? It is a sort of dark, quasi-Victorian, quasi-steampunk, quasi-horror heist kind of setting. So players by default are they play members of a gang that they kind of create in this horribly creepy city called Duskval, and they're involved in running scams and schemes and heists, depending on what sort of a crew they are, to get by and to make their mark on the world. What's cool about it is the goal here was really to get away from the minutia of like coming up with plans and working out what are we going to do and arguing back and forth with all of that. And I think the goal of the designer was really like cut to the action right away. So it really emphasizes within the rules like, okay, it has a structure where your crew is always going to be going out on scores. You sort of define what your basic goal is. Who are you targeting? Are you going to focus on a rival gang and you're going to like steal their supply of illegal drugs? Or are you going to stick it to the man and sneak into the police station and plant some false evidence there or something? You do that, and then the GM says, okay, great, we're in it. We're doing it. Roll a couple of dice, sets up. Here you are at the police station. Here you are at the gang's hideout. Now what? And you can always use a system of sort of flashbacks and related mechanics to say like, we ran into a trapped door. Well, good thing we planned for that. Here's a scene where we went over the blueprints and talked about what we would do in this situation. So that's why I'm responding like this. Or this is why this character is now appearing. I've been hiding in a barrel the whole time because that was always part of the plan. So I pop out there and things continue. So again, lots of surprises from all fronts, lots of player agency, a very rich setting that you can play with in lots of different ways. And yeah, just unique, a lot of fun.
That's cool. I feel like when you said Blades in the Dark, basically this entire room's like, oh, I know this one. I want to nominate this one. Bryan and Sascha and Jordana, did you play this too?
I haven't played it, but it's on my list.
Okay, it's on your list. Yeah.
Let's play
recognized the name
sometime,
and was like,
Jordana.
oh, that's a thing I'm excited about.
Well, the other two, and I'd be down to play it, by the way. I want to play some games. The other two, Bryan and Sascha, you both lit up. Your eyes went, whoa. Why are you so excited about this game? Or you were going to nominate it probably, right?
Sure. So actually, the funny thing is I wanted to put this on my list is that I only have peripheral knowledge of this game. So I probably spent about 20 or 25 hours watching games being played and podcasted. This was kind of a pet project of mine that I started putting together last summer. I was just scrolling through my FLGS's like website and, this cool small rulebook with this like hooded figure in the dark on the front. I was like, okay, cool. Like, let's check this out. And reading through the rules, I just thought it was like really kind of flipped standardized formatting. Oh, yes. I also have mine it's just out of reach.
Everyone's
Sascha.
showing books.
It's great for the audio format to hold up a book to a webcam.
But the big thing for me was I think that it takes GMing to a whole new level where as opposed to the GM really setting the story and making sure that your characters can get to the end in whatever way that they're trying to find, is that the GM is much more part of the crew than any other rule set that I've looked at. Because you really want to be there with the group. You really want them to explain that they can do something and why they can do something and get to the end. And, you're part of that kind of experience. And, as Joe was kind of bringing up, is that there's no real planning aspect to this. You're not kind of hindered or hampered by your GM needing a certain amount of time to come up with these heists, you can tell your GM what you want to do and why. And the rulebook is planned out so that, you know, you can be like, I want to do it in this section of the map. And like, it will tell you all the gangs that are in there and all the personalities. And it's just like, you know, really clean getting there. And I think it also introduces a mechanic in the game that I've never seen kind of done in another system, which is the flashback mechanic. So, you know, the kind of talk that they do in the rule book is like, oh, you know, you are waiting in line to get into a party and the guards are checking everyone as you're getting in. I see Sascha's face here. I'm not sure if this is actually the one in the rule book. It might have been one of the online references then. And they're checking everyone for weapons. So, you know, your crew wants to bring weapons in with them. And one of your characters will be like, oh, well, like, let's flash back to last night because we knew that they were going to be checking us. And let's hop over the wall and plant our weapons inside before the party's like really starting. And then, you know, you can take some stress. We'll get into mechanics later on, I guess, as we're debating our top 5 here, so that there's a reason why you can still get past these kind of roadblocks or, you know, gatekeeping instances while still making it thematic for your crew without having to plan stuff out. I just think it's a really well thought out system. And also, as Jordana was pointing out for GURP, is that it's a D6 system base. I think it's like really accessible and stuff. And I will stop ranting now because I like it. I think we should keep going.
We should keep going.
Let's move to my rant. I think we should go to my rant.
Go to your rant.
The look you were seeing on my face wasn't correction. I'm just excited by everything you're saying. I think it was exactly right.
Yeah, I'm in person with Sascha right now. His nerd sweat is just dripping right now. It's all over my table.
I'm going to say I agree with everything Joe said and everything Bryan said. I think those are excellent arguments in favor of Blades in the Dark. I'll add a couple of things that are favorites of me. The fact that the crew, the party, has its own character sheet and grants abilities to everyone is amazing. That means if you pick a social crew, the hawkers who are like buying and selling and so on, one of the abilities you can pick is everyone gets social skills. So even if your character is a cutter who's a tough fighting boy, you might still have some ability to negotiate or intimidate or make contacts because you're part of a hawker's crew. So the character sheet kind of sets the tone of what kind of heists do we want to do? Are we assassins? Are we Ocean's 11? You pick that. So the group kind of agrees in advance what kind of heist they want to do. And then it gives you the skills you need to succeed so you can make your character the way you want and trust that your crew is going to get you in at the minimum level. I think that's a brilliant way to sort of trick the players into agreeing on what they think is fun ahead of time. Genius. Love it. And leveling up your crew is really fun. Everyone discusses together like, ooh, I think we should get a motorized carriage. That would be neat. Or like, oh, we need better cover identities. Let's take that. And then you have it. So cool. And you get NPCs. You have your doctor. You have your expert safecracker who you bring in from time to time, and you've paid for them and built these characters. And you're like, oh man, I don't want to bring old Lucky again. He, last time he failed his role or whatever. I'll also add quickly, Bryan touched on this, but it has a list of all the gangs and power groups, the city council, the people of Dunslow, the Red Hooks or whatever.
I can't tell if you're making up these names or if they're real names.
Well, half of them are real. One of them was made up because I couldn't remember. But it's the Red Sashes, not Sashas, but Sashes. Anyway, they all have different power levels and they have different friends and enemies. And you're encouraged by the rules to start out already friends with some, enemies with others. It's one of the only games I've seen where I cared a lot about the existing social groups and like, all right, we're friends with the city council, but that's going to cause us trouble when we run up against the spirit wardens. They're looking to, and so that was really cool. I've never cared about that before, but I'm happy to do a heist in Blades in the Dark to improve my reputation with this group so that they'll ally with us against this other group. It really encourages you to get involved in that in a way that makes sense.
That's cool. We'll move on because we have to. We're only on the first round here, but this game does seem really cool, and I'm bummed that Joe, our campaign, never actually took off. Maybe one day. One day. Sascha, you want to go into your second nomination?
My second nomination is Blades in the Dark, but I'm going to move right on. I'm going to move right on to my third one. So
my second nomination is also Blades in the Dark, Sascha. So.
Okay, good. We're in the same boat. I'm going to move on to one that's kind of a little more obscure. This game is weird, it's unique, and it's one of the best games I've ever played in my life. I think it's criminally underrated.
You're holding a book.
I'm holding a book. This is great. So it's called Dread.
He's not just holding a book.
It's called Dread. Dread is a system that's contained in this little tiny book. It's the size of a Goosebumps, and it kind of looks like one. And it uses a Jenga tower instead of dice. And when I heard that, I thought, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Give me my dice. But actually, it is genius. This is one of the only role-playing game systems I've ever played where the players genuinely become afraid without the GM having to try. Like, it's hard to scare players in an RPG because in reality, they're sitting around a well-lit table with friends and drinking and laughing and checking their phones, and funny things are happening. And that still happens in Dread. But as the Jenga tower, which represents impending death, gets more precarious, everyone begins to tense up. Everyone becomes genuinely concerned in a way that is amazing. It also has one of the best written rule books I've ever read in my life, not just because the rules are explained concisely, but also because they're only about a third of the book. The last 2/3 of this are basically a series of essays about what makes something scary. How do you tell a good horror story? And normally that would turn me off very much because I don't want all this backseat driving from someone else about how to GM. But this is really well written. In fact, if I just wrote horror stories and I had no interest in any tabletop games, I would buy Dread and just read the back half. This is a brilliant read. It's incredible. And finally, to keep this brief, because I know we want to catch up some time, it has one of my favorite character creation systems ever. It's collaborative between the storyteller and the character. And the way that it works is a character sheet is a questionnaire. So I might make a questionnaire ahead of time called the athlete, and I might make another one called the nerd or whatever. And when people are sitting down to play, I'll say, okay, who wants which sheet? And someone will say, oh, I'll take the nerd. That sounds fun, or whatever. And then once you take it, it just has a series of about maybe 5 to 10 questions. And it will say, oh, what's your biggest strength? Or what are you afraid of? But it could also be a leading question like, why did you drown your best friend when you were 17? Who knows about it? And the player reading this is like, oh my God, I drowned someone? But whatever answer they write becomes the truth. And during the game, that's essentially your character sheet. Like if you said, oh, my greatest strength is I'm a great runner, when a test comes up involving running, you'll be like, well, I based on my question, I'm good at this, so I get a bonus or whatever. And people will agree. But this is a way of setting up a plot. In fact, you can make one of the players be a sort of traitor or a monster themselves by writing like, why do you want to kill the other players? What did they do to you or whatever? Or you can have them agree with someone else. This is really interesting, and it produces some great ability to inject some strange behavior into the character group by the DM in a way that feels empowering rather than forced for the characters. Everyone responds well to it when I've tried it. So Dread by Windmill Games.
That's pretty cool. I do have one follow-up question. We'll move on here. What happens when the Jenga tower collapses?
Well, when the Jenga tower collapses, for any reason, whoever last touched it, their character dies or is removed from the story. And you would think this would cause narrative problems. It doesn't. They have thought very hard about how to handle this. And you can also make a choice when you're pulling bricks to do difficult things rather than rolling dice. If you think it's going to fail, you can say, I'm going to willingly knock over the tower. And when you do that and strike it down, your character dies, but you succeed at whatever you were doing. So there's this chance for heroic sacrifice, and many people think about it. Then they're like, no, I can pull 2 bricks. It's not that bad. And then they die in the middle of it, and they go, oh no, I was eaten by a weasel. And it's great. There's a genuine sense of a pall falls over the room when the tower falls, and everyone's shocked. It's great.
A sense of dread, perhaps?
A sense of dread.
Jordana, what's your second nomination?
Before I do my second nomination, I just want to say Sascha scooped me so hard 2 times in a row.
Oh, you were going to do Dread?
I was going to say Dungeon World. I was going to say Dread. Stop
sorry.
it. But Dread is an amazing game. A nomination that I don't know if other people will agree with me for this nomination because I love it out of like a sense of weird nostalgia. It was like baby's first TTRPG.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Which is Shadowrun.
Oh, yeah.
And like, I love Shadowrun for, I feel like, reasons that are not entirely sensible because it was my first TTRPG. And like, I'm just like, oh no, I'm like, I just love it. But I do feel like the lore in Shadowrun is like second to none. I love the lore of Shadowrun. I think it's really well thought out. I think like doesn't just hit like it hits fantasy and sci-fi, which is great. So you're already getting multi themes there, but it hits both of those themes in a way that I feel is really flexible. So like you could do it more like a spy thriller, or you could do it more like a classic sort of like more fantasy focused like dungeon crawler. So there's like lots of different ways you can apply Shadowrun, which I think is great. It also only requires D6s, so it scratches my itch for not owning fancy dice. Not that I don't like owning fancy dice.
I was going to say, isn't that the dream of all the nerds in this room, is to own as many dice as possible?
But fancy dice are expensive, and you need to have somewhere to keep them, which is difficult for people with small apartments and a lot of art supplies.
Gotcha.
But just a little background on Shadowrun, science fantasy RPG, as I was saying. It's pretty old. It's 1989 was when it was originally published by, I think it's FASA, but it could be FASA. I don't know how, actually. I've only ever seen it
heard
written.
FASA.
I've never heard someone say it. So like it's a pretty old one. It's had updates, but I don't think it's really in the way that it's had like additions.
I think they do. I think they're on like a 5th or something
Okay,
now.
they do have
'cause
additions then.
I've
I
heard
knew
some
they had
people playing
updates.
it recently.
Also, just I cursory Googled it because I felt bad about not knowing about GURPS editions. They do. They have 4th edition. They have 4 editions. I don't know which one I played, but it was good. Yeah, but Shadowrun, I feel like is a really versatile game. You don't need to own the rule book necessarily. Like if you have a good enough DM, you'll figure it out. It is a little more rules heavy than something like Dungeon World or something like Dread. It's a little more crunchy in that department, but it's no more crunchy than something like Pathfinder, for example. I actually think it's easier to do than Pathfinder. I think it's more understandable. So there's that. Yeah. What else was I going to say about this? I don't know. I love it.
That's fair enough. Everyone else, Shadowrun is, I assume it's a very popular. I've heard it in
Shadowrun
passing.
is a classic.
It's a classic.
They also made a video game.
That's probably why I
there's
know
been-
it.
Yeah. And you mentioned fantasy / sci-fi. Specifically, it tends to be in the cyberpunk kind of genre. I don't know if you mentioned that.
I hesitate to say cyberpunk
Yeah.
because
I guess you
theoretically
could-
cyberpunk is its own like game.
That too, yeah. That was my back. I was more experienced with or knowledgeable of the cyberpunk game that I maybe somebody will mention, but I don't know.
There's this section that you can play in Shadowrun that's actually super fantasy and very little sci-fi, where you visit the Feyan Court, and like if you decide to play your game in the Feyan Court, like it's very not sci-fi. So you can kind of you can choose what suits you best.
Cool. How about we move on to Bryan, second nomination?
All right. So my second nomination was going to be Blades in the Dark. So let's move on to my third. And I promise you, I'm not sponsored by them whatsoever, but I'm going to move on to Paizo's Starfinder, which is what I was alluding to last, being kind of Pathfinder 1.5, but it's actually in a sci-fi setting, which I think is really great. I want to get this out of the way at the front. Is I don't think that the rule set is anything special. I've read a lot online. People are like, oh, this is a really complex and complicated rule set. I don't think that that's the case at all, but it is a very clunky rule set. But there are certain things that I love about this game that I've played with my group. We've played a couple years of Starfinder, and I just think that it does some really great things. But if you're looking for other rule sets for sci-fi campaigns, like maybe look at games like Coriolis, or even the Alien RPG from the Ridley Scott franchise. They offer some really cool mechanics that are in those. But this one, like once again, like games like Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons, the character sheets are set up kind of in the same way. So if you have knowledge of D&D or games that are similar to that, it won't be hard for you to catch on to this rule set and to move up from there. What I love about this, though, is the customizability of your characters in regards to playable races specifically. You'd really hope that something in a sci-fi game gives you options, because, we've all watched, probably a crazy amount of sci-fi movies, and, there's no end to what, you can kind of see and experience. So as I was double checking my notes here for Starfinder, I was looking it up on Archives of Nethys, because it also has a partnership with Paizo, of course, to release all of the rules for free online, which is fantastic. Is that as of Friday, yesterday, when I was checking, I guess maybe this isn't going to go out on a Saturday, but on the Friday that I was checking, there was 118 playable races. So if you want to be just a normal human like I normally do, you can do that. But if you want to be a giant floating brain, you can do that.
Wait, Bryan,
if
you
want
choose
to be
a human over a giant floating brain?
I almost always play humans in my campaigns.
That is what?
You're one of those.
I know. I get a lot of looks.
What?
So
I feel like that's a whole other podcast, but we'll move on. Keep going.
Can I jump
Go ahead,
in
Brian.
on that? I haven't played Starfinder. I know a little bit about it, but
Yeah,
my
sure.
understanding from like scanning the rule books and hearing some actual plays is another aspect of the customization. A lot of these classic games, you sort of pick an ancestry and a class, or a race and a class. So you've got your whatever, I'm an orc fighter. And this one throws in, you also have like, is it occupation or something? That it's sort of a background thing, but it also kind of levels up a little bit as you go. Is that?
yeah, so it can kind of work out. So if you were looking at the Pathfinder rules and before, it's a lot like the dedication system. It's not as refined as the dedication system, but yes, so you can have that extra level of specificity to your character and tailor that a little bit more. So, we could both be playing Vesk soldiers, which are the giant lizard people, but we can actually build them in very drastically different ways with different motivations. And then those motivations actually have, I was going to say consequences, but it's just additions to the rules that you can be playing then.
Nice. Anything else on Starfinder? Anyone else want to add to
I
this?
just want to throw in one last thing for Starfinder. So once again, I don't think the rules regarding this part are the best in the best way that they're laid out, but there is actually starship combat in this. It's done on a gridded system, but it's not square grids. It's, oh my God, is it
Hex grids?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was octagonal for a second. I was just
you're
second guessing myself. So it offers this extra level of kind of exploration and kind of troubles that you can run into, as well as then you get to build your ship for your crew. So it feels like you can build very Firefly-esque crews where your ship is still one of the characters that's part of your gaming experience then.
That's super cool. My last question here is, can I use Jenga to play Starfinder? Yes or no?
As long as there are no
Yes.
follow-up questions, then yes.
Okay, cool. Great. I want in. Joe, second nomination.
Oh my God. Okay. Let's jump to another sort of oldie, a game that's been around since, again, I was a kid reading my brother's Dragon magazines that referred to all kinds of obscure games that I knew nothing about. But I remember hearing about this one. And more recently, it's been updated and modernized and streamlined in its rules. But this is a game that actively messes with the minds of the players, might turn them against each other, make them question everything that they understand about who they are and the world they're playing in, but does so in a very silly and lighthearted and kind of low stakes way so people don't actually hate each other, probably. Caveat, I've never actually played this. I bought the nice little box set. I've looked at it. I've made up little worlds. I hope to play it. I just got to find the right time and the right group. It's a game called Paranoia. So basically the setting for this one, without going too deep into the details, because there are sort of supposed to be some built-in things that people don't know about it going in, but it's a high-tech dystopian society future where the players are all cloned lackeys, basically, who are spit out of a tube in this complex called Alpha Complex. And their friend, the computer, has his little voice in their ear that tells them everything they need to know and is always with them, watching them, advising them, punishing them if they get out of line, awarding them experience points for doing good things like doing their job well or informing on traitors in their group. So just to give you an example of how the game messes with the players, right from character creation, you are handed a little cheat and you get to sort of choose, okay, it's your turn. You choose one skill that you're good at. Great. I get a +1 in demolitions. Okay, now the next player to your right gets to choose one skill that you're bad at. So they say, well, they're terrible at talking or whatever. So you're actively like sabotaging each other right from the character setup. In most role-playing games, this kind of, we call it PvP, player versus player, kind of screwing with each other, trying to hurt each other, is usually seen as a bad thing, usually leads to tables falling apart. But again, with Paranoia, it's really built into the system. The characters being clones, you have little like checkboxes of what clone you're on. So when your character does have their head exploded or is shoved into an elevator shaft or whatever, it's fine. You're going to spit out a new one seconds later. You just like cross off the box. So then it's just kind of like the feeling of, okay, well, now I'll get you back, whoever did that to me kind of thing. But yeah, very unique, weird setting, weird stories. And the GM, I guess, gets to play this ridiculous computer who knows everything, but maybe doesn't know anything and is all powerful, but deeply flawed.
That sounds cool. Sasha, you raised your hands in the air like
in excitement.
In
I raised them in
excitement.
such a way as that I just did not care.
You've played this game?
No, well, I haven't played it, but I wanted to mention that, Joe, everything you said about it, like hearing about it peripherally through Dragon Magazine or like reading about it on a forum, but never actually having played it, that's my experience with Paranoia. And I also really want to play it because it sounds so cool and unique. Everything about it sounds fun, but I digress a lot. I just want to say you and I have basically the exact same relationship to the game. So
yeah, it's got a sort of legendary weird status that it's been around for so long, but nice little like sleek boxes that you can get for not too much money now that have all the info you need to run it.
Yeah, if it's been modernized and updated, that's huge. I think that's very, very interesting because the age of the system is what was putting me off of it. So
Cool.
Yeah, it's also just like 6-sided dice. One little detail of it is that anytime you try to do anything that could be remotely dangerous, you roll these dice, you also roll one special 6-sided die that has a little eyeball on one of its faces. And if that eyeball comes up, it means that the computer was watching you and you've done something terribly wrong. And things are going to go awry. So again, like very chaotic. in a fun way.
Well, I always wanted to be a computer, so maybe I can be right now.
Oh my God. He's watching us.
I gotta stop. I won't stop. Let's go into round 3 here, the final round of nominations. Now, Sasha, it is your turn, but I urge you not to take Jordana's pick if you can.
He won't. He can't.
I have two options that I'm
Jordana
debating
wrote.
between. So the real answer is Ironsworn, which is also has a sci-fi version called Starforged. Was that your pick, Jordana? Because
No.
if it was, I'm going to move to this, I think it's
Oh, boy.
Swedish game called Morkborg, which is written like the liner notes of a metal album, including one page with mirrored text. It's insane. And the instructions
That's
tell you to
amazing.
burn the book when the world ends. Like there's rules for when you need to burn this book and never play again.
I wish we had a visual component to the show.
It
'cause
would be way
Sasha
better.
brought like 8 books. I don't even know. A lot. There's a lot of books.
I'm a visual person. Okay, I'm going to go to Ironsworn. I'm going to keep this brief. Ironsworn by Sean Tompkins. It also has a Firefly-esque sci-fi version called Starforged, which is like a revamp of many of the core rules, but a different type of setting. Ironsworn is the one I'm going to talk about, though, but if you're interested, there's a sci-fi variant with better rules. That's all I'll say. Ironsworn is a game where the main thing that jumped out at me is how interesting and unique the character creation is. It's very simple. You have like 5 stats, which we're all kind of familiar with: strength, or in this game they call it iron. You have iron and spirit and so on. And you're good at one thing, you're not so good at a couple of other things. So you pick those. That's your character. Very simple. But you also you don't pick a character class. You're not a fighter or a wizard or a talkie lad. You have a big deck of assets, as they're called. And these could be something like Shield Master or the Ritual of the Black Spider, which is a spell you know how to do. But it might also be an NPC. Like it might be a pet wyvern, or my bodyguard, Carl, or my faithful horse, Gustav. They don't all have to be named Gustav. I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm really sabotaging myself. But essentially, you pick 3 of these, and that's your character class. And I think that is genius. People have so much fun. So you can have 2 people with the exact same stats, both good at iron and whatever. But if one of them picks Shield Master and Bodyguard, and I have a good horse, that person is quite different from the one who then picks 3 spells, the Ritual of the Blood Fighting or whatever. And so the picking of the assets and the fact that no duplicates are allowed between the players makes it so interesting. And you could make a character whose class, so to speak, is just that you pick 3 social cards where you have another person. So you could have a pet, a bodyguard, and an expert ship maker or something who are with you. And that's your character class. And those will be mechanically powerful and interesting. It's fascinating. The combat is inspired by Blades in the Dark and Dungeon World, where there's not too much minutia. Although there's a little more, it's pretty intuitive. And lastly, I'll say one of the interesting mechanics in this game is that you gain experience by making vows in character. I will stop whatever is attacking this, or, you touch iron and you swear to do it. And then you mark progress as you fill that in. And when it's done, you get experience for resolving your vow. But there's a mechanical system for it to reveal a surprise to you. Like, oh, you didn't really get the real culprit. Who else was behind it? And that's a surprise to everyone at the table, including the storyteller. It has these narrative curveballs it throws you. It's also one of the only systems I've ever seen where going on a journey has good rules to support it and is interesting and fun. Going like, we must reach the mountains in the north is actually fun and interesting, even if you don't fight a bunch of wyverns on the way. Just the act of crossing rivers, getting supplies, haggling, those are interesting and they're well supported by the rules as you manage your supply track. A lot of the abilities are about being better at finding paths and managing supplies, which is something that's always been boring in the games I've tried to run. And I really want it to be cool, and it never is. I take it as a personal failing, but Ironsworn saved me. It was actually fun repeatedly to do that. And final note, one of the big selling points, not for me, because I love GMing, but one of the selling points for many people is you can play this with no GM. You can play it solo, and there's lots of rules to generate stuff by getting prompts from what's called the Oracle. You roll on these tables to like, what's a hidden motive? What's a strange surprise? What happens on a journey? You can use those if you're GMing. You should use those if you're playing alone. And you can also play with multiple players, but no GM. And it actually works quite well. You can't just announce that you win everything. I mean, you could, I guess, but it has a lot of good systems to prevent that. And so if you're interested in a GM-less, all players storytelling style where you really don't know what's going to happen, this supports it really well. It was designed with that in mind.
That's really neat. I like that. Yeah, I find it's tough for me as someone who would never GM something because I don't have time to read through these 6 novels that you put on my table over here and memorize all these rules to the point where I feel confident in doing that. As a player who just wants to have fun or something like that, it's cool to have the ability to just be like, okay, this book's supported enough that I can just play this game.
You could sit down and start playing Ironsworn, and it would tell you what to do next if you get stuck. So you
Yes.
could approach it that way with no GM.
I'm a sheep. Tell me what to do. Jordana, what do you have as your final nomination?
Okay, so my final nomination, I was pretty sure Sascha wasn't going to pick it because it's super niche. And it's still in development.
That's how niche it is.
I haven't played it. Likely none of you have played it. In fact, I kind of think the only people who have played it were the people on the one shot where they featured it. But also, like, small confession, I have actually only played ever 6 TTRPGs. And literally all of them have been listed except one. And it was the one I didn't love. So I decided that this one was a good option because you all stole my thing, Sascha.
Great
I'm
minds.
so excited to hear what you're going to say because
I'm glad. I don't know how excited you're actually going to be, but there is a theoretically in development. Honestly, I think they might have canceled it and they're not doing it anymore, but it is a King Killer Temerant epic fantasy series role-playing game.
Oh, that's not what I thought you were going to say, but I'm very excited. Yeah.
So
Sasha's writing
the
stuff
reason
down.
it's super duper niche is because it's set in the world of the King Killer book series, which is a thing I do a podcast on. But it's
Plugs are later,
super...
Jordana.
I just snuck that one in
Yeah,
there.
yeah. Hey, what's it called before you keep going? The name of the game?
It is the King Killer Temerant role-playing game.
Oh,
I
that's
don't
what it's
think
called.
It has
Okay.
like an official name.
Cool.
That's just
And the novel
what
that
it
people
is.
might recognize it from, although the series is the King Killer Chronicles, is Name of the Wind, if that's a more familiar name to any of our listeners.
yes, The Name of the Wind, The Wise Man's Fear. There's like another smaller book called The Slow Regard of Silent Things. Anyway, all of these written by a fantastic author named Patrick Rothfuss. He also plays the game with some people on a one-shot podcast. So like if you wanted to get a taste of what the game is like, that's a place where you can do it. I mostly just liked it because it seemed as accessible as most other, like, say, like a Pathfinder or a Shadowrun. Like it has kind of a similar rule set, or so it appeared, based on the one shot. I just like it because it is set in the world of the King Killer Chronicles, and I happen to really love that world. So perhaps this is more of a personal choice than it is me trying to sell it to you.
That's
but
fine. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hey,
there it is.
I love it. I love just
I'll
getting
just-
introduced to new stuff is cool. Yeah, Joe, you have something to say?
And I'll just jump in, having also listened to that one-shot series. I really enjoyed it. It has a unique vibe, a lot of fun, and it was just very cool to hear the author of, you know, a very popular unfinished as of yet series playing as a player in this world that he's created. So there's somebody else as the GM who he's trusted to kind of flesh things out, and they're kind of collaborating on this stuff, and that's a really fascinating thing to hear.
Wow.
If nothing else. Yeah.
I would have imagined he was the GM. It must be so surreal to be a player in a fantasy setting you created with someone else GMing it to you.
Be stressful as the GM, I think.
Absolutely.
It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
You encounter a no, the goblins wouldn't be here. You see,
Just for the people at home who are curious or tickled their fancy with what you just said, where can they find that podcast of the one shot?
Well, one shot is like a regular podcast. I think they're just called one
One
shot.
shot?
The one shot podcast. It's
yeah.
sort of a net. They have a lot of associated ones, not to compete with Podcavern.
Yeah,
here or
never.
anything, but
They couldn't
I
even
was
compare.
I would say we
ask
said
if
we
we
were
could
saving
sneak in
plugs
a
for
recommend.
later. So.
We're
Yeah.
plugging other people's shows, which is
Yeah.
something we normally don't do. But one
There's
shot.
a great Shadowrun podcast on their network too that is ridiculous. Neo Scum. Anyway.
Don't tempt me.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, Bryan, your final nomination, what's it going to be?
All right, so I've had to go down to the final one that I had made notes about because Shadowrun has been taken. Yes, so now it has come back. So I might get some, I believe as the kids say, shade for this. And I feel like I should be wearing like a corporate sponsorship shirt at this point. But this was one of the games that really did make me want to continue playing tabletop RPGs and playing as frequently as possible. Like, you know, when I had started in high school and just getting out of high school and playing, you know, I was pretty content with the like once a month kind of thing, or the once every other month, and getting together and rolling some dice. And I ended up working at a hobby store, and 4th edition D&D came out, which I know was not a well-liked edition from the masses who play tabletop RPGs, but I really did love it. It had a very video game feel. And I think one of the things that fourth edition offers that a lot of other games don't offer is the ability to do preset dungeon crawls that are actually very interesting, very engaging for your character creation that you can do. It's fantastic. It would still be something that I'd want to do, like, a one shot of like at a cottage one weekend or something like that, where we don't really need to get into too much of the backgrounds of our characters. We can know about their motivations and things like that. And it's just a dungeon crawl about getting to the next fight, to the next fight, to the next fight, which you don't have to do when playing D&D fourth edition. It does have a full role-playing section, just like you would in any other edition. But the combat features in fourth edition, I think, is unlike anything that I've played in another rule set. So one of the things that you actually run into is, of course, like a lot of the other D&D editions, you have a minor, a movement, and a standard action. But combat-wise, or being doing encounters and things along those lines, is you have an at-will power, an encounter power, and daily powers as you start leveling up. So those at-will powers are something that you can do every round. You have an encounter power that you can do once an encounter, so like once a fight, and then you have a daily, which means that you actually have to do your full night's rest before it kind of respawns, and you get multiples of these as you start leveling up. So it actually really does help you define what your characters can do in combat. It really helps you separate roles. They do split it up into like 4 main roles, which we can get into in a little bit. But I just found that was so interesting. We could I was gonna say 4 of us, but Tuong's also here. The 5 of us could all play. We could all play Rangers, let's say, and they could all be drastically different because we're picking different powers. So not only are they different in encounter and fighting aspects, but then also in our role-playing kind of encounters, we can be doing very different things as well. So I think it offers something that I haven't really seen done in another format, and it was at the bottom of my list here. But for anyone who's like used to playing video games or is familiar with big games like World of Warcraft or things like that, where you're used to building into like a skill tree, that's the best way that I would kind of make that comparison there, is like you're building your skill tree with powers that have certain cooldowns and timelines and interaction abilities.
Cool. And are we at 5th edition in Dungeons and Dragons now? Is that what it is? Everyone's
but we're on the cusp of a new one coming around too.
All right. Well, I was wondering if anyone was going to say Dungeons and Dragons in this group, so I'm glad you did it. Let's move on to the final nomination. Joe, what do you have?
Oh boy, yeah, I've been wavering here, and I don't know, something that Tuong said a while back about he'd love to play more games, but doesn't have the time to read through the rule sets and all that jazz. I think I got to throw a wild card into the mix here and say I'm holding up the rule book now for this game, and it is basically just making shit up with your friends. And the only reason why I'm putting this one out here is because probably I played D&D for a long time in different versions and spent a lot of hours doing that and played all these other handfuls of games that we've mentioned. But probably one of the ones I've played the most in the past 10 years is just freeform systems, loosely based on some of these various games. Cool, we'll make up some stats, name them, roll a die and add it to them. Not worry too much about the mechanics, come up with mechanics that kind of loosely fit the genre, the story that we're trying to tell. Sometimes they had a thing like we played a sort of kung fu mystical demon fighting thing that had like a built-in haiku generator that we'd created so that whenever any named character dies, they generate a random haiku, and that can shape the story in drastic ways. Just like that kind of collaborative homebrew. Rule systems are great, but let's put that off to the side and just come up with what story we want to tell together. Can have some pretty fantastic results, assuming that you've had some experience with some other games before, so some of the language and can just kind of go along with it. I also know some people, there's an improv friend of mine in Toronto who would run tons of games, and he really didn't have a gaming background and did not understand much how these systems worked and did not let that stop him at all. So he just made, again, these simple rule sets. Were not balanced, didn't make a lot of mathematical sense, but they worked for creating a lot of fun and making up stories. So
your final nomination is Our Imagination.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess with all of these games, it kind of rules so that your imagination can go wild. So the next logical step is throw all of that out the window and just go for it, right? Mm-hmm. I like that. But it does sound like, I guess it sounds like with your friend, they can make whatever they want up. But I guess if someone like you or Bryan or Jordana or Sascha were in the room to just do this, you would probably borrow from all of the 30 games that you've played collectively together, probably, yes?
Exactly, yeah.
Nice. Well, that is our 12 nominations. Let's take a break. And when we're back, we're going to rank top 5 tabletop RPGs. We'll be back.
This thing on?
Yes.
Oniric.
Notes to Oniric, Day 1. By Teffer Troy, doctoral candidate, Alternative Narrative Traditions, Université de Montréal, October 12, 683.
Oniric.
Hello, Deirdre. I hope you're well. I'm recording this now because today's a big day. I'm meeting with a talking wolf after lunch. I'm a bit nervous about it.
Oniric.
A flame that rides the winds of worlds. A flame that seeks a single torch. The torch burns bright. The torch burns out. The flame remains and rides anew.
Oniric.
It's a dream quest. It's a grail quest. It's a fever dream quest.
Oniric.
Just say hi. Please. Do it, do it, do it, do it, do it.
For fuck's sake. Hi, Deirdre. Hope you're well. You're well rid of this idiot.
Oniric.
Coming fall 2023 in the Podcavern and wherever you get your podcasts.
Top five.
Hello, everyone. We are back. The gang, the party is at it, ready to roll some dice and make a top 5 list. And I think this is a pretty good list. And as someone who hasn't heard of 3/4 of this list, I was pretty intrigued by everything that everyone has talked about so far. So let's just read the list as it is, and we'll somehow make a top 5 out of this. Dungeon World, GURPS, Pathfinder, 2nd edition, Blades in the Dark, Dread, Shadowrun, Starfinder, Paranoia, Ironsworn. This is the King Killer Tamaran?
Amaranth, but you can just call it the King Killer RPG.
I'll just do that. The King Killer RPG, Dungeons and Dragons, 4th edition. All those 5th edition nerds are being like, Bryan, how could you? And
I'm fine with that.
Yeah. And the last one is Freeform Systems, or Your Imagination, or Make 'em Up, or whatever you want to call it.
Sorry.
The Power of Friendship.
The Power of Friendship. Yeah, Joe, you want to give it an official name, just so we have it in here?
Let's say Play and Pretend.
Play and
I like
Pretend.
alliterative titles, yeah.
I like that. Very improv-y. Okay, so we're going to have to somehow make a top 5 list, but I'm going to get Sascha, out of the nominations that I have listed, you star a nomination that isn't one of your own for further consideration.
Okay, well, the obvious one for me, which is a little self-serving, is to star Blades in the Dark.
Blades in the Dark is starred. We'll get Jordana, star a nomination that isn't one of your own.
Definitely Dungeon World.
Dungeon World is starred. Bryan.
I am going to star Shadowrun.
Shadowrun. And
Nice.
Joe.
I'll go with Pathfinder.
Pathfinder.
Deserves a star.
So right now we have Dungeon World, Shadowrun, Pathfinder, and Blades in the Dark that is starred. Is there any other nominations? I'll open it up to the floor here. If you think it has a fighting chance to be on the top 5, now we all know y'all love these games. Everyone's had pretty positive things to say about every single one of these games, and unfortunately they can't all make the list. So I'll open it up to the floor again, and it can be one of your own now if you want to star anything else.
Can I actually cut one from our list to make things a little bit easier?
You can, if yeah. I mean, the ones that aren't starred are going to be cut anyways. So
okay,
yeah.
Well, then maybe I can just help everyone. I brought it because I thought it was like really something that I want to talk to people about. But if someone came to me and was like, "What are 5 RPGs that I should look at?" I would not tell them to look at 4th edition D&D. There's a whole wealth of games out there that you can be looking at that don't have to be one of the D&D editions. And I think that, especially if you're starting out, there are other things that you should be looking at. So I wanted to talk about it a little bit because I get excited about that, but I understand that I love that game, but I would not say that it's in the top 5.
You are making Chris Pine cry right now because he's in the Dungeons and Dragons movie. And
Chris Pine makes enough money that I don't mind if I make him cry.
That's true. That's true. You're right. Okay, sorry, Chris Pine, our regular Patreon subscriber here.
I would love to just jump in on this, just to throw it out there that like I love that we are all too cool for D&D on this list. I think that if Brian hadn't mentioned fourth edition, I would have been happy to throw in like, hey, we can mention D&D. I definitely am one of those ones who would prefer a fifth or a third edition to fourth, but on the whole, I'm glad that we are all a little bit above it. People know about D&D. There's nothing wrong with it. You can play it. You can have a lot of fun, but
Yeah, is this the level of this group where...
Oh, I will take that one further. There is something wrong with D&D.
Okay. I mean, yeah, there are things.
Can I jump in and say I thought I was going to be the cool guy who doesn't mention like 5th edition, and I thought all of you were going to be like, obviously 5th edition, but it turns out we were all on the same page, which I think is amazing.
Jordana, you want to give your like cliff notes, your 2 sentences of why you have a problem with D&D?
I think that the barrier to entry is too high, and there's a lot of gatekeepers for that game.
Okay.
Like, as someone who had a lot of trouble getting into TTRPGs, like, I didn't get into them until I was like halfway through my 20s because I was scared of the people who were playing them.
You know what? Chris Pine did say I can't play with him when I asked him, so that you're right.
I've played more Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition than any other system, and I played a ton of 4th edition too. And like I've played, it's my most played, but I have a love-hate relationship, and as I've grown older, the hate has eclipsed the love.
As you matured.
It's like a relationship where initially everything's butterflies, and then you start to see the flaws and you realize you're not right for each other. And I think Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition and maybe 5th edition are not right for many people, but we have to acknowledge its contribution.
Yeah,
it's apparent.
It is the mainstream thing that a lot of people like myself only know. Well, I feel as I'm a little bit higher than that, a little bit more nerdy than that. But I would say like a lot of people who don't know tabletop RPGs at all can only really point to Dungeons and Dragons and probably had never heard of any of these games that we listed today.
In fact, when I if someone like my parents ask me what I'm doing and I'm playing Blades in the Dark, I say I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons because they're not going to understand if I say Blades in the Dark. Kind of like how in the 90s, if you did any martial art, you had to say you did karate because no one else understood what you meant.
Sure. Well, you can give your parents this podcast and maybe they'll learn a thing or two.
That's my plan. That was my long game for appearing on this, actually.
Just a self-serving podcast for Sascha.
Okay, and in terms of stars, I'll once again just say the ones that are starred, but we do need 5 at least starred. Dungeon World, Shadowrun, Pathfinder, and Blades in the Dark. Is there any other RPGs you think should make this list? Anybody can go. Yes, Jordana.
I'm thinking Dread, partially because both Sasha and I mentioned it, but also because the barrier to entry is super low. Anyone can play that game.
I wanted to star Dread as well. I think the barrier to entry is really low, and it kind of tricks you into GMing well, even if you've never tried it. The one caveat I would add is you have to be interested in a horror story. It really wouldn't work well for other genres, but for those who are, it's the best gateway system for sure.
Joe?
Well, I was going to echo that. I haven't played Dread, but everybody I know who speaks of it just talks about how much they love it, and I think it's a great example of a more narrow game that supports what it's trying to do really well with its mechanics. It's not trying to be any kind of story that you could possibly want. It is doing that one thing and using mechanics to support it. I feel like Jordana was about to have maybe an exception to that point of it's only for horror stories. Maybe. If not, I will.
A little bit. Yeah, you're good at sensing that. I think that it could be applied to like a mystery theme as well, but you'd have to rejig a couple of things.
I think that's so fair. I'll agree to that.
And stealing a little bit, again, we've both, Jordana and I have both mentioned this one-shot podcast, which we can't avoid plugging, I think, if you just want to get a taste of a lot of these other games, because there's just a lot of stuff out there that you can hear played. So something that I've heard on there is a game called Star-Crossed, which actually is essentially Dread applied to a troubled or problematic romantic relationship. Wow. You're playing 2 people who should not get together, and yet there's romantic tension, which the tower represents.
Wow,
so if you knock that over, something's happening.
There's still Jenga. That's the only thing that's pulling me into this Dread thing. Is like, Jenga's a thing I can do. That's pretty easy.
I'd never heard of Starcross, but that sounds so fascinating as a concept, and I think that would probably be a good use of the tower in the same way. You have this growing sense of like, oh no, these 2 are going to end up together. Oh no.
How big is this Jenga tower, or do you just use a Jenga Jenga tower.
You use an actual Jenga tower. It doesn't come with it.
Doesn't come with an official one.
You go to Toys R Us or whatever and buy a Jenga tower.
I can buy the big like novelty huge ones that they have.
You absolutely can.
All right,
I'm in.
For more
Kong
effect,
special
or you
edition.
could be cheap and just go to the dollar store and get the knock.
And get the really tiny one instead. Okay. Any other ones that we want to star? I'll actually list the ones that aren't starred, and then maybe I'll spark anything in you guys. What we have that isn't starred: Ironsworn, GURPS. Still love saying that. King Killer RPG, Starfinder, D&D, although we kind of cut that. Paranoia, and Play and Pretend.
Just with no personal experience with it, I just want to maybe have this chat with Jordana about GURPS and maybe if this is something that we should be discussing a little bit more, simply because it is a universal system that you can apply to whatever your group is into. Especially if you learn this rule set, then you can continue on in whatever kind of facade that you want to put this on, or skin it in any way that you can, to make sure that your group doesn't need that downtime of learning a new system while switching between genres.
Yeah, GURPS would definitely fit that need. I think that part of me, of course, really wants to start GURPS because obviously I nominated it, but it's hard to sell. Like, I don't know how to sell GURPS to you other than telling you that like it is as easy to play as Pathfinder. It's just like, I think GURPS is better than Pathfinder because I think you can apply GURPS to more things, but people love Pathfinder and I don't want to fight.
No, fight on the air. We love it here.
Yeah, for me, the idea of GURPS, again, not having played it, there's a couple issues with it that stand out to me. I think one of them might not be, one of them is just like, because it's an older game and that's where I know it from, I feel like it necessarily probably has some of that old school baggage, that sort of needless complexity. That might be totally false. Like you said, there have been 4 editions or whatever. Maybe
I found GURPS easier to play than Pathfinder, but I played the first edition of Pathfinder, not the second.
I had the same concerns as Joe, but if you're saying it was easier, then I believe you, obviously. So that's a misconception for me that got cleared up.
Yeah. The other thing that I would say, though, is just that given that it's like its whole goal is to be a generic role-playing game that you can do in any setting, any style of game, it's sort of like, if I'm playing a role-playing game, I kind of want rules that do a particular thing, that add something to the game. And if I want something generic, again, this is me coming from that like improv-y freeform background. That's worked for me before. Like, I don't feel like I necessarily need all that rule set to support it. But for other people, it might be really useful and effective. I don't know.
Yeah, well, so the thing is, like, the reason I like GURPS is also the reason I like Dungeon World, but Dungeon World's easier to play. So I don't feel the need for GURPS to be in the top 5 if Dungeon World is there.
Okay, fair enough. Any other nominations on this list that you think anybody here can make the top 5 here? There is some passion behind Starfinder, Paranoia. I like the idea of Play and Pretend. I think that's like the most accessible thing you can do. We used to play playground stuff back in the day with our imagination. That's just this, but with dice and a few more rules. Yeah.
I would argue that playing Pretend is actually really difficult and has a high barrier to entry for people who are shy or people who like don't really have like the ability to imagine imagery. So like there is a high barrier to entry that we kind of see as invisible because probably a lot of us have played the games. So
also to be, sorry if I'm interrupting. Also, to be fair, Play and Pretend on a schoolyard, how many of those games of Play and Pretend ended up with someone storming home or in tears or punching somebody else?
That was me,
they didn't agree.
Plus, you can't hurt me. I'm invincible. And I've got a machine gun that shoots machine guns and a dragon.
Force
so
field.
You do got to
Force
have some common language and you know.
Fair enough. Okay.
Skills there.
I would let Ironsworn go, but I will add, if you only have 2 players, Ironsworn is really good. I also think Paranoia deserves an honorable mention as the best game if you like to mess with your friends and you want some mischief. I think that one's going to blow everything else on the list out of the water.
Yeah. Given that
I
none
don't
of
like
us...
Paranoia because of that.
Yeah, it's not for everybody. But like my partner, she likes messing with other people. Jordana can back me up on this. She would probably be very drawn to Paranoia for that reason.
The game for shit disturbers.
Exactly.
Sounds like a game for me. And you're saying you're willing to let go of Ironsworn, is that right?
I think so, for sure. I think it deserves credit as a game that's good for 2 players. I think it plays really well, which most RPGs, I think we can all agree, don't. But apart from that, I don't think it's going to compete with the other ones that are in the list.
So this is really interesting because usually what happens is we get like 6-starred or 7-starred and we end up up going through like a system called locks on this podcast where we lock down our favorites and like then we start arguing with each other and Joe gets thrown against a wall and then there's tears and yeah, but we actually have 5-starred. And that's a top 5 list. So
we have to figure out which is the one. We have to order them. Yeah,
we will order them, and hopefully some imaginary fists or real fists will be thrown. Be hard because we're on a Zoom call, but never know with the power of imagination. So, Dungeon World, Dread, Shadowrun, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and Blades in the Dark. That is 5. What is number 5?
Pathfinder.
Either Pathfinder or I would say maybe Shadowrun.
I was going to say Shadowrun.
Yeah.
You burned
I could do
me.
either. I think Shadowrun has one of the most amazing settings ever, and I think it's super iconic in the imagery. Like, and if anyone has played Cyberpunk 2077 or whatever it is, that is very obviously heavily inspired by Shadowrun. It casts this enormous shadow over, pun not intended, over media that comes after it. I think the setting is super unique, but the rules can be very impenetrable, or at least they were for me. Like resolving a gunfight in Shadowrun takes as long as like a whole session of Dungeon World or something.
What? That is insane. So like those sessions can go like days or like weeks.
I'm talking about an older edition of the rules, but like it would be something like, okay, I fire my shotgun at the enemy, and then you're like, okay, let's consult the table. We'll do a little basic calculus to see the pellet distribution, and like that's probably not so much in the new editions, but it can get very bogged down in a way that a new player or new GM can be intimidated or misled by, I want to say.
From what I've heard, again, I think what I've listened to in actual play has been their 5th edition. They keep coming out with new editions, but they keep a lot of the roll 12 dice. Now you roll 5 dice and add your soak stat and take those dice away and then see how many dice. Like it's just stages and stages and a lot of dice.
Okay.
I'm not going to deny that.
Yeah, okay.
So it sounds like number 5 is Shadowrun. If everyone's cool with that, thumbs up, everyone. Okay, number 4. What's number 4?
Pathfinder.
I'm going to step in here.
Yeah. Fight.
I think it needs to be much higher. I think it's a really good game that has nuances to it. And I also want us to, I'm not trying to say that it's as black and white saying this, but thinking that a game is easy to play, therefore it is a good game, is a good criteria for something to be the number 1 tabletop RPG. I think that it has really good merit about, getting groups in, especially getting new people in, or, we're all adults now. We have a hard time finding the time to really play and do things like that. But Pathfinder can be as hard into roleplay as you want it to be, as hard into combat as you want it to be. You can really get into the nitty gritty of what your character can do. Like, I'm sure we've all looked at things like, I'll make this comparison because it's not even on the list, like the 5e, let's say. Mm-hmm. So, there's very general stats that are there, which is something that's, across multiple rule sets. But then there's just like really basic things like, you're proficient or not proficient in a skill and you add your stat to it. And like, that's how good you are. Whereas, Pathfinder really gets into having trained expert, master, and then legendary in specific skills, which of course I understand is more bookkeeping, more things to keep track of and things along those lines. But it also just means that like, if you build, let's say a rogue and a sneak character who's good at, sneaking and picking locks and, sleight of hand, you can really make sure that they're not just generically the same at all of those interactions. The same thing goes for charisma-based checks, right? Like intimidation or diplomacy, which are very drastically different things, but kind of getting to the same result, is that just because your character is charismatic doesn't mean that they should be just as good as both of those things. And having those deep dives into the stat skills specifically, I think is really good. I also think that like the feat system in Pathfinder 2e is really good and really good compared to a lot of other kind of similar genre games. Once again, we can bring in the WotC Dungeons and Dragons kind of system that's there, but like you are getting feats in Pathfinder at every level, which helps your character do different things. And those feats are actually split up into 3 different sections. They're your ancestry. So like, I think that's one of the great things too about Pathfinder 2e is that they don't call them races, they're ancestries. There are also your class-based feats, and then you get skill feats. So once again, if you want to get into the minutia of what your character can be doing, you can be taking very specific skills and skill feats to be doing those things. Once again, you can get into like no combat whatsoever and have this kind of tailored experience based on your character. You can get really kind of down into the nitty gritty that's there. I believe Joe had brought up like the occupation style character development in Starfinder, is that there's the dedication classes that are in Pathfinder 2e, which, you know, can give you a lot of combat things, but also like out of combat things. And they help build your character. Like the campaign that we actually just finished, I played a 1 to 20 campaign in Pathfinder 2e. We played pretty much every week for the last 3 years. And, you know, I was able to build a bard who was a gnome, who was a lion blade, who's like, you know, focus was on political espionage. And, you know, he was tailored into things like running through crowds and disappearing when he wanted to, and things along those lines, which really push forward those actual role-playing mechanics and having your character do what they're supposed to do based on not only what you want them to do, but the limitations set forward by what your character actually is.
I was just going to say, I'm so mad because I'm jealous that you're able to play Pathfinder every week, because I would love to be able to do that. I'm trying to get a campaign going like once a month right now, and it's been 2 months since the last one, and it's hard, but I want to play more.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other big things that I actually do love about like a system mechanic that we're all probably used to, that I think that Pathfinder 2e does better than anything else, is the crit system. So we're used to critically passing or critically failing attacks. I'm sure, you know, by rolling a 20 or rolling a 1, you know, we all were, I think, even joking at the beginning about rolling a nat 20 and things along those lines. That's still relevant in Pathfinder 2e, but it also applies to skill checks and saving throws. So you can actually critically pass or critically fail picking a lock or having a conversation or anything along those lines, as well as they have the plus minus 10 kind of mechanic built into that as well. So you might not roll a 20, but if I roll 10 above whatever the DC or the difficulty check is for that, I count as critting. If I roll 10 under, I actually count as crit failing. And I think that actually offers a lot more opportunity. You're not just so scared that, you know, oh, I only have a 5% chance of rolling a 1, therefore I'm just going to, you know, make these crazy kind of, you know, skill assumptions and move forward there. There actually are consequences to even rolling, you know, let's say under a 10 for certain things for your characters, because, you know, you don't want to hit that threshold of being like under 10. I think that that's actually like really fantastic. And then also, you know, the way that the dedication and multi-class feat system kind of works then as well. I think that it really offers this experience in overall mechanic that we're all really used to. Like, you know, people who are playing a lot of RPGs have had some sort of knowledge and or play of Dungeons and Dragons and or, you know, game systems like Shadowrun or things along those lines. But I think that this system really is so dynamic that it needs to be talked about a little bit more here, I think. And I think that more people need to be trying this out. And, you know, just to put this line in the sand is don't play 5th edition, play Pathfinder.
I mean, I don't think anyone's going to argue with you here.
I definitely agree with that. My impression with Pathfinder, if I can jump in, I'm embarrassingly ignorant about Pathfinder because I stopped at 3rd ed. My impression about it is that for a lot of people, Pathfinder 2nd edition is the best role-playing system for what they're looking for. If you want a lot of like crunchy rules that are going to let you build out your character and be very, very specific, I think this is the one you should choose. It's going to beat out most of the other ones on this list, which are more game time focused rather than like creation and like picking specific feats focused. And I think there are a lot of groups where Pathfinder 2nd edition is going to be their top pick for what they're looking for, which is like the classic Dungeons and Dragons high fantasy with more crunch and more specifics in your character. But on the criteria of accessibility, it might be one of the weaker ones in the remaining list. But that doesn't mean it's not a great game and that it shouldn't be higher on the list. So your passion has moved me to view it higher. But if we're ranking accessibility, I don't know if it's going to break the top. Like,
I think that with this list, and I'll jump in here, is the audience surrogate here, is that yes, accessibility definitely a thing to just bring you into the game. But if you have someone like I assume everyone in this room can GM a game quite well. Sascha, you've done it like a zillion times. And Joe, you've done it for me a billion times too. As long as you have someone who's like super knowledgeable about the thing and that could help guide the normies like me into like playing the game normally or like streamlined, then I think that's enough. And then the next part of the equation for like what should be our number one is like, yes, accessibility, but also how fun it can be and how much more I want to play this game. But I think what I gathered from Bryan's impassioned speech over here is that it is obviously his number one. So how about we put a pin on that and just see what everyone else's passion is? Because when we look at like Dungeon World, everyone loves Dungeon World in this. Dread, Blades in the Dark, everyone was like, oh, Blades in the Dark. So I feel as though to me, the one that stands out again, being on the outside, is that Dread might be our number 4.
I knew you were going to say that.
I mean, like, I'm just going off of like, if Bryan is super passionate about Pathfinder 2E, maybe we move that up a little bit. And if everyone is really into Dread, but it's not everyone's number 1, unless it is, and I'm misunderstanding, maybe we just put that at number 4.
What I want to throw out here is like, Pathfinder might be hard for some people to get into, might not be the preferred genre for people to get into, but if you get into it, if it's for you, you're going to want to play it every week if you can. You're going to want to build and build and build and be in that world.
Exactly.
Dread might be an amazing game that a lot of people, if you have any interest in horror, could jump in, have a great time with. I imagine it's suited to one shots, so you just like play one night.
Yes.
You tell a story, that's great. You probably don't want to play it every week. You might play a couple times a year, right? Or just like come back to it every once in a while with new people. But it's not going to be like a lifestyle thing so much as some of these bigger sprawling games, right? Which I
think that's all
see
very
as a
fair.
Positive thing for the big game overall of like,
Okay, well, if
you're into it, it has a lot to offer.
Jordana, you're the only other person, Sascha too.
I accept Dread as
number
being
4.
as number 4. It is very genre specific, so it doesn't fit my accessibility criteria as much as I would like it to.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. It's genre specific and it's not that well suited to an ongoing campaign. It works much better with a series of one shots, which I kind of view as a strength because I have trouble scheduling games and getting recurring groups. But a lot of people do want the classic experience of meeting every week, leveling up, picking new feats. And Dread is going to not provide that. But what it does provide, it's the best at. So I'm fine with it at number 4 in that we accept it's really good, but it's a bit more niche than these other ones.
Hey, all these games are in the top 5. They should be honored to be in our top 5 list.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Everybody knows what I'm going to pick for number 3.
Yeah, a Pathfinder?
Shockingly.
So now we're in the nitty gritty of it all. Pathfinder, Blades in the Dark, and Dungeon World. I think these are the number 1s of a lot of people in this room. I'm impartial. I'm just the moderator here. Do we see Pathfinder, for everyone else that's not Bryan, any higher than number 3?
I'm actually fine with the other 2 games that are there, with Pathfinder being at number 3, because once again, I think that it has the replayability factor that, you know, Sascha and Joe were just talking about there. But there are other things that you're looking for in a group. And sometimes when you are playing RPG games, you only want it to have a 6-month lifespan before you start something new, whether or not it's in the same system or not, which I think that, you know, all 3 of these top 3 games can actually offer then. But, you know, I think that Pathfinder offers this very kind of classic style tabletop RPG experience that, you know, we're all very accustomed to, but there's a lot more out there. And even though I would want to play Pathfinder more often, I'm actually more excited about Blades in the Dark. So I would, even just on that kind of scale alone, I'm quite fine with Pathfinder being at number 3 on the slot here.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, please do.
So my impression is like, I feel we're leaning towards Blades in the Dark as the number 1. I feel like it's in the sweet spot between... No? Okay, Jordana's disagreeing. I'm cool with that. But I wanted to say, on the topic of Dungeon World and Pathfinder, I feel these 2 compete in a way, but really it's more of a symbiosis, where what you want is a classic Dungeons & Dragons. These are 2 sides of the coin. If you're more into telling the story and coming up with zany stuff and drinking more at the table and spending less time on character creation and less of a long-term campaign, more rules light, Dungeon World is the winner. If you want that crunch, the depth, the specificity, the very complex, very off archetype characters, then Pathfinder is way better. Like if you want to make a rogue who's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and has 3 levels of whatever, Pathfinder is much, much better. But if you want to sort of get in and tell a classic D&D story, Dungeon World is going to be faster and more accessible. So I feel like they're kind of splitting based on what the players want, is what I want to add. Like the different players will have a right choice between those 2. And in that sense, they don't compete. They're like, it's just a matter of, did you find the one that's right for your group?
Just the thing that I was going to throw in there is in terms of the narrative and the world, the fantasy setting. If you're the kind of person who loves having a wealth of stuff to draw on, like you cannot do better than Pathfinder. Just looking into like, oh, well, the dwarves in this region are split between these factions and these communities and tend to worship. So I'm going to do this one, but I have this relationship with this ancient silver dragon. That's all there to draw on and use or not use. And whereas Dungeon World is like, yeah, do whatever. It's fantasy. You come up with the world while you play.
Yeah.
You don't have to have much at all to start on. You figure it out while you go. And you ask questions to each other
That's an excellent point. And it's a really good way of illustrating what I was talking about. Like if you want an existing setting that's really rich, Pathfinder is way better. But one of the principles, one of the like rules in Dungeon World is draw maps but leave blanks and ask questions when you get there. So you might draw a mountain range, and when you get there, you ask the dwarf player like, what sort of beast lives in these mountains or whatever. Some people really prefer that and are looking for that, a world where you're building the world and drawing a map as you go. But for other people, that's horrible and they hate that. And they want a detailed world with lots of lore, lots of stuff you can research, and consistent settings. So again, I feel
mathematically balanced.
Yeah. So again, I feel it's about choosing what's going to fit the mood for your group.
So with all of that said, it does sound like Pathfinder is number 3, which means Blades in the Dark versus Dungeon World. Jordana, let's hear your
Dungeon
thoughts.
World is the hill I will die on.
Okay. All right. Noted.
So, if I may,
yes.
As a person who like, I feel like I am very new actually to TTRPGs, and like without Dungeon World, I would not be able to GM. Like, I don't think I'd be able to GM Blades in the Dark. Not like, I mean, I haven't played it, so I cannot necessarily speak to that. And I know that you said that like you can play it without a GM, but like I want to be able to do that thing. And like, I want to be able to control the world more than it appears that you can do in Blades in the Dark. And like the idea that you can't apply like a pre-built map to Dungeon World is silly. Of course you can.
That's
you don't
true.
need to build the map.
It can help.
You can just give it to people
on hand. Yeah.
Yep. Very true.
Especially in the short term, that kind of planning, there's definitely still room for that.
Yeah, like if you want to be the kind of person,
here's some dungeon.
Yeah, like if your players are like, oh no, we want you to give us lore, we want you to give us everything else, you can just like pick up a Shadowrun or a D&D book and apply all of that to Dungeon World.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, Joe, anything on Blades in the Dark versus Dungeon World?
I got lots of thoughts, but you go first.
Then, I was going to say my short one there is just then there's nothing stopping you from using the Blades in the Dark rule set and that kind of feel and mechanic in a different city of your own design. Then you're not hard and fast, and without getting too much into the story, you're not going to have Pinkertons at your door, getting mad at you for
very topical.
But realistically, like you could say that about anything. Like we could say that about 4th edition D&D, right? Like you could put that in any world. You could just use those rule sets and stuff like that. So I don't think that necessarily having a pre-built city that is a resource that you can or don't have to use is necessarily a negative.
That said, it's so built into Blades in the Dark. Like you can totally use those rule sets to go other places. Example of that, again, sorry, I'm plugging podcasts. A lot of people probably are familiar with the Adventure Zone out there. They played D&D for years and then have since been playing other games. Right now, their podcast is doing a Blades in the Dark run that is set in a sort of weird Disneyland Westworld theme park. Very different setting. They bend a lot of the rules away from Blades in the Dark, but they make it basically work to do what they want to do. But it's drastically different. Like a big strength of Blades in the Dark for me is the detail of the setting to the degree of, as was mentioned before, like, yeah, this gang exists, they're super flavorful. And if you look up in the book, it suggests that like these 3 people run the gang and they hate these 3 people and this one's having an affair with these people, which is, again, all stuff you can take or leave, but it's just like pre-built web of intrigue that supports the rules of the game so well. It works really well as what it is, and you can make it do other things, but I don't know if that should be that feels very secondary.
That should be
I can throw something in on this real quick because I have a friend who loves Blades in the Dark, and they love the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and they're adapting a game called Imperium Maledictum to be a Blades in the Dark thing. And I can see how much work they're needing to do to make the homebrew. And Blades in the Dark has many things on, like each character sheet has 1 or 2 abilities that are about interacting with ghosts and the ghost field. It has a skill called Attune, which is about seeing ghosts, and it has items on the character sheets called the Ghost Key and the Spirit Talisman. And at character creation, it tells you, pick one social group you have a favor with and one you have an enmity with. So you could absolutely make your own setting, and you could even make different classes and stuff. But the amount of work you need to do is non-trivial. Yeah. And if you skip making new social groups or whatever, or you make them up at game time, you will find that causes problems. So I think to adapt it to a new setting, you need to be a pretty experienced gamer who understands how to port something over. And you need to be willing, at least one person, the GM is going to have to put in some serious time. But you can do it. but it would be way harder to play Blades in the Dark. Blades in the Dark is great for the like see what happens during the heist aspect. They're top notch for that. But for the like invent the world as you go, Blades in the Dark, you will find it much more challenging. If you want to kind of create your own setting and improvise a lot, it's going to get in your way more. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it also means if you haven't invented a world already, you can go with what's in the rule book and you get a very interesting, well fleshed out system. I think it's about how much you want to improvise, what you're looking for.
One more little thing to throw out there, not to talk in detail, but there are offshoots of Blades in the Dark, published ones. They call it the Forged in the Dark system. For example, a game called Scum and Villainy, which is the sort of sci-fi band of mercenaries, Firefly, whatever version of Blades in the Dark. So some of that work has been done for specific genres and settings, if you're into that.
Which I would recommend if you want to do a sci-fi one, get Scum and Villainy rather than buying Blades in the Dark and then trying to fix it yourself right away, because you'll save yourself at least a couple of weekends if you do it that way.
So I think out of everything that was just discussed here, I feel as though ultimately, Blades in the Dark or Dungeon World feel very fitting to be our 1 and 2, whatever order that ends up being. So at this point, a lot of discussion points were made, and we're going to go with the gut feeling. Out of all the things that we just talked about, what does this group want to play? Because ultimately, it's this group's top 5 list, right? We're trying to like help out other people to, be accessible to, like, we talked about all these things about the mechanics and all this other stuff. But like when I put these 2 games in front of you right now, hey, guess what? I'm GMing somehow for tonight, and I present you 2 games to play tonight. I want to know what game you'd rather play. Sascha.
Real quick, in this hypothetical, have you read all the rule books thoroughly?
Yeah, hypothetically, I am very good at knowing things.
Okay, so me personally, I'm going to say Dungeon World.
Okay, Jordana.
Dungeon World.
Brian.
Blades in the Dark.
Joe.
Dungeon World. And I've played both of those a lot in the past year. Just to get back to, I think Jordana really summed it up, that like it's a good game to DM for your first game. You don't need to know a ton of rules. You need to get into the style of it. And it's the best game to teach you how to GM other games, because the principles can be applied to anything.
That's the key point. The GMing section in Dungeon World will make you a much better GM than the GMing sections in other books. And I know because I've read the other books and been a bad GM for a long time. And this helps.
I'll also just say that my choice there is just based on the fact that my knowledge of Dungeon World comes from the 3 of you guys right now. Like, I just don't have like a reference point. Whereas I also think that, with the way that Blades in the Dark worked, like Tuong being part of our group then to play would be like kind of fun.
Yeah.
But once again, if you guys came to me and said, hey, do you want to come and play Dungeon World with us tonight? Tuong's going to run the game. I'd be like, yeah, of course I do.
And you're like, Tuong's running the game? Are you sure you want him to run the game? Can any one of us?
Only if Tuong is running the game.
Yeah, so this is part of my answer. If you want to play an ongoing campaign, I think Blades in the Dark is better. But if you're having a one-shot and it's a person who's new to DMing, you will have a much, much better time with Dungeon World. 100%.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that point there.
So part of my answer was like, I'd love to see you, Tuong, DM Dungeon World, because if you have improv skills, which you do, as I know, Dungeon World is going to make them sing. Like, it's going to open up all kinds of creativity at the table. If you want to play an ongoing game with more crunch, where you slowly build your criminal empire, both mathematically and narratively, Blades in the Dark is going to offer you more than I think most campaigns in Dungeon World will.
And I could speak to speak to both of these games because I have a little bit of a relationship to both, because Joe tried to run a campaign with Blades in the Dark, and we did play like a one-off of Dungeon World with me and Sascha over here. And with Blades in the Dark, it was one of those things where I'm like, I just want to play a game with Joe again, because like Joe just knows so much and he's so creative and he can make all these worlds and kind of helps me do all the heavy lifting. But I don't really understand like the 40 pages of text over here, and my eyes just gloss over the back of my head. And I'm like, Joe, you figure this out for me. And as we were making the character sheet, I was like, all right, I'm getting into it. This sounds really cool, but I'm definitely not picking up on some of these things. And it's one of those games where you, Joe, were like, we'll cross that bridge whenever we get there. And, that's cool. But with Dungeon World, it was definitely one of those, improv stuff where it's just like, okay, we just reached this point of conflict or whatever, and we can just fill in the blanks ourselves, and whatever we say goes, and it just is. And at the end of the session that we had, we drew this map of the session that we just did, and it's like, oh, that's a nice little, I could frame that because it's just these are memories.
I have it up on my desk at work.
Yeah, and I really enjoy that. And like, when we talk about tabletop RPGs, I guess there is the two coins here. Yes, it has become more mainstream for people to get into, but still, I think most people don't have the time or in their schedule to do the weekly. We're not blessed like Bryan to be able to do that every single week. So for me, the thing that's much more interesting is like, can we do that one shot, or maybe at most like the 3-time campaign or whatever for this one little thing. And I think that's why Dungeon World is much more appealing to me, is because we can just do that. Because I'm going to forget the rules by next week, 100%. But if I can just make it up as we go, nice.
That's also why it made a lot of sense to me for Bryan to pick Blades in the Dark, because if I was playing every week, I'd play Blades in the Dark 100% over Dungeon World. But if I was playing a one-off or had a lot of new gamers, it would be Dungeon World.
All right. Well, this is our list then. Number 5, Shadowrun. Number 4, Dread. Number 3, Pathfinder 2E. Number 2, Blades in the Dark. And number 1, Dungeon World.
I'm excited.
Yeah, air horns back. That's a great list. I think that's fantastic. How about we go really quickly into honorable mentions? You don't have to give me a spiel about every single one. If you want to, you can just give me the 1 to 2 sentences. But if there's anything else on your list that you just want to shout out for the people at home to check out after they played the 800 hours of these games, they want to check out something else. How about we go with Jordana? Anything else on your list that you want to shout out?
I mean, I really love GURPS. I think it's great. People should give it a shot. That's all.
Okay, great. Bryan, anything else on your list that you weren't able to say?
Yeah, so there's an RPG called Liminal, and it's actually like a modern day RPG that's has a supernatural element. So, you know, vampires and werewolves and all of those things. And there's kind of like, you know, the two different worlds. Not as campy as this, but you can think of it like, you know, the classic Halloween Town movies where, you know, there are two separate worlds that are there, and your character has ties to both of them. And, you know, you kind of build a party along those lines then as well.
That sounds cool.
That's a really cool rule set. Yeah.
Nice. And that's the last one you have for honorable mention there, Bryan?
Yes.
Nice. Joe?
Oh geez, I got a bunch of things. I don't know. I want to plug 1,000-year-old vampire, I think, because one thing we haven't mentioned here is you can play role-playing games by yourself if you want to. There are journaling role-playing games that you can play solo that just like basically a very fancy book that gives you prompts that tells the tale of being a vampire over centuries and losing your mind. That's something I've enjoyed this past couple of years.
Is that different than a choose your own adventure?
Yeah, it's much more about coming up with your own story rather than reading what happens.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Anything else, Joe?
Oh, I guess the other thing I'll say is just since Dungeon World ended up at the top of our list, I don't think we really mentioned, like, again, from a systems place, Dungeon World is also part of a huge family of things. It spawned off of a game called Apocalypse World that totally, you know, breathed new life into role-playing games. So if you don't love the sort of typical fantasy genre of Dungeon World, you can do post-apocalyptic, you can do superheroes with masks, you can do a romantic comedy with something like any genre you can think of. There's a Powered by the Apocalypse game that does it quite well, probably.
Fantastic. Sascha?
I mentioned Morkborg earlier, the Scandinavian death metal one. I'll also throw out at one game that I love the idea of and I haven't played enough, which is Microscope. It's a game for collaboratively world building, and you end up with a world or a setting. So what many people do is they play a game of Microscope and make a world, then they pick some other system and play a game in their Microscope world. I think that's awesome. I've never done it, but it's got to be mentioned. And I'll also throw in a little mention from Mouse Guard, based on Burning Wheel, which is a precursor, I think, to the Powered by the Apocalypse games, the same people. Mouse Guard, where you play as little anthropomorphic mice who live in a little fantasy world, and they have little tiny fish hooks for weapons.
So it's Redwall.
It's very much like Redwall. And the monster section in this, like the enemies, is like an owl, a cat, a crab, a squirrel, and it's amazing. And those are deadly monsters. Like I'd rather fight a dragon than a freaking cat in Mouse Guard. The cat's gonna wreck you. But anyway, it's a cute game. And your inventory is whatever you can fit in the little box. So if you have neat handwriting, it'll work.
That's incredible. What's that Goblin game that we played together?
Oh, Goblin Quest. Yes, that was I just found out about this recently. In Goblin Quest, you play as a clutch of goblins. You have like 5 goblins. You draw little faces on them. The rule tells you have to do a goblin voice, which is whatever you want it to be. And whenever you try a skill check, the most common outcome is like you die in the attempt and you move on to your next goblin. And like your goblins have a skill, but it's usually like furniture or hiding or failing to hit something or whatever. And so you just goofily fail to do stuff for the entire adventure.
If we talk about accessibility, like that was a very goofy, very fun one shot that we did with that Goblin Quest game. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's just the whole thing is like, yeah, let's say goblins can die just doing a thing. And it's very funny.
You draw little goblins as you go. You write how they died. It was very fun.
All right. Well, this has been a very enlightening and also extremely nerdy conversation, which I enjoyed.
Don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you all were doing the nominations today instead of me, because I would have just been like, Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know which one. Still Chris Pine, I guess. The movie.
Well done, dog.
Chris Pine. That's my top pick.
Yeah. Or I would have just said one of the many tabletop RPG video games that exist out there, but they kind of like, I don't know. That's not really in the spirit of today's category, which is much more pen and paper or your laptop kind of thing. But let's go into plugs, which, Jordana has been trying so hard to plug her stuff and other people's podcasts during the show, which we are not sponsored by. But Jordana, you have something to plug. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I'm on a podcast too. Not this one. I'm on a podcast called Page of the Wind, where we analyze deeply. We essentially do like a deep dive page read of one page of Patrick Rothfuss's King Killer series every single day. Every day. There is a podcast episode.
Every day?
Wow. Every day. Every single day. We are more than 1,800 episodes in. We are now into the second book. So we cover the first book, which is The Name of the Wind. And then we cover the second book, which is The Wise Man's Fear. And yeah, we like dive into crazy theories. We get mail from our listeners that we read, and it's really cool. We have a Discord where people can, that we did not make also. Our fans made it. So I can't really take credit for the Discord, but it's a good time. Our fans get together and like talk about King Killer stuff. So yeah.
So I'm sure it's been said, but I guess your podcast is the official clock for Pat Rothfuss finally finishing the third fucking book, right?
That's true.
I mean, in a way, I guess we try not to talk too much about that topic because Rothfuss doesn't like it, and we like Rothfuss, and we would like it if he liked us. So I'm
sorry, Patrick.
my big spiel on whether or not we get a third book or when we get it is like I'm a journey, not the destination person. So like if we never get it, that's okay. I still love the books. I don't need a third book in order to love the books. It's fine. I want a third book, but it doesn't. I'm no pressure is how I feel about it. I definitely don't want to be on the bad side of an author. But yeah, you can find that podcast at www.pageofthewind.com or on any regular podcatcher.
That is incredible. I'm just so blown away and impressed that you were able to put out a podcast every single day.
It's not just me. I'm only 1/3 of this podcast. There are two other people, Nick and Jeremy, who work very hard to help produce it.
Amazing. Well, yes, please check that out. Joe, Brian, Sasha, anything to plug on your end?
I was going to second Page of the Wind. It's great.
Good. Yes, let's keep...
I think Sasha guested on some of our early episodes. Is that true?
Yeah, I was in a few episodes until you guys realized you shouldn't have me guest ever again, and then I got you guys. No,
you hadn't read enough of the book, or you weren't like crackpotted enough for us.
No, I really enjoyed appearing on a few episodes. It was fun. But also, I'm going to throw in cheese. I like cheese. I think people should eat more of it. So that's my plug.
As a health thing, or just because they should enjoy them?
No, it tastes good. I'm just going to throw that in. Just the abstract concept
Do you have a
of
cheese you don't like? Is there any cheese that you don't like?
There are many I don't like, but everyone is different. I don't like the cheeses that taste and smell like feet, but some people are into that.
So how do you feel about like American blue cheese?
I really don't want to get into like naming and blaming individual cheeses. This is too heavy. When we do the top 5 ranked cheeses.
Their fault.
Hey, you know what? I was just thinking we've never done a cheeses episode.
Bring me back.
I'd be invited.
Yeah,
I
you
also
can.
really love cheese.
Bring me back for this one. Friulano is a Canadian cheese that's critically underappreciated, but that's a story. I'll save it for the
save it for the cheeses
cast.
episode.
Save it for the cheese pod.
We will do a cheese pod. Mark our words, everyone. We're going to do a cheese pod, and we'll do live sampling of cheeses. And might get gassy in here. We'll see what happens. Brian, Joe, anything else that you want to plug on your end? Want to plug Jordana's podcast too?
Yes, I would also like to plug Jordana's podcast. I think everyone should be doing that. No, this I just want to say thanks so much for having me, Tuong. This is actually my first time being on a podcast, so hopefully I made sense. And things were at least slightly coherent as I was chatting about things. So, but this was a lot of fun.
You're a natural, buddy. And I actually thought this was Sasha's first podcast.
No, I used to. I've done a few. I'm sorry. I misled you.
You misled. You teased me into the podcast room.
My podcast virtue has already been taken. Damn it. I'm sorry. You wouldn't have invited me if you'd known.
And I'd like to plug Joe as being a good cuddler. So
actually, I do have one to throw in here just to give me some impetus. I'm currently a teacher, so I have no time for playing games or other creative pursuits or maintaining my relationships. But I hope to have free time again, maybe in the summer, and someday soon to finish up a document I have, which is a role-playing game I've been working on called Spaceship Unicorn. The idea being that you're a member of a crew of sort of a Star Trek The Next Generation / in the world of like a cartoon like She-Ra, where everything's fantastical and friendship is important and things are sparkly. But, a silly game where you go on away team missions and some of you might be cartoons and some of you might be sentient plants. So I hope to someday get that up on itch.io or whatever. Who knows? Google it when this comes out. Maybe I've done something.
Yeah, well, whenever it does come out, we'd love to play it and hear about it and all that other jazz.
Can we be alpha testers here? You got a good group.
Absolutely, I can send it out to you.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, speaking of friendship, I do believe we rolled a D20 on friendship today. Am I right, guys? All right, well, that's it.
What was the result of the roll?
We rolled a D20, but what did we get?
Oh, we didn't kill each other in this podcast, and we still remain friends afterwards, and maybe we'll play something in the future. So...
I rolled a D12 by mistake.
At least a 17? Okay. Well, I'll think of what else we can have later. But for now, you can find the rest of the shows in the Pod Cavern at www.podcavern.com. Hope you enjoyed today's episode.
And let's get out of here. Bye, everyone.